Hi folks, Joseph Kursky here. As usual at this time of year, I'd like to summarize my favorite books over the past year. This is going to be for 2021, and as a geographer, of course, I read geography, but also history, mathematics, GIS, some novels, biographies. Let's get into it. Last year I read 65 books. I'm going to summarize my favorites by month. In January, I read Wilson's book called The Mystery of Charles Dickens. I love Charles Dickens, and this is all about the complex life that he had, so different mysteries about him. Also in January, I read This Tender Land by Kruger. Fascinating. And Ordinary Grace, great novel set in Minnesota. In February, my favorite books were Weird Things Customers Say in Bookstores by Campbell. Funny, wonderful. And also The Truthful Art by Professor Cairo at the University of Miami. Great infographics, statistics, some mapping in that book. And then I read two novels by Kent Harif about the high Great Plains of Colorado. Sadly, Kent Harif is no longer with us, but we could read his novels. Also, I read a book on US 36 by Ferguson, which was fascinating, all the way from Ohio to Colorado. In March, my favorite books were definitely Land, It's This Thick by Simon Winchester. I love everything by Simon Winchester. This one's called, quite simply, Land. And I also read The Best Is Yet to Come from one of my favorite preachers, Tony Evans, Minister Tony Evans. And also I read Breakfast at Sally's by Richard Lemieux, and that's all about his experience being homeless in Seattle, basically. That was March. April, my favorite book was Picard County Atlas, set in the Nebraska Sandhills by an author from the University of Nebraska named Thornton. Love that book. In May, my favorite book was The Finer Points of Sausage Dogs by Alexander McCall Smith from Scotland. And it's great because it gently pokes fun at academia, but it also respects academia, but it's completely hilarious, especially if you're in higher education like I am. I also read The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna. It's a fictional book, but it's set in the Grapes of Wrath Dust Bowl era, and that was fascinating. June, my favorite book was probably Let Them Eat Pancakes by Craig Carlson, about opening a pancake shop in Paris. Oh, I love that book. And in July, my favorite book was The Salt Path, all about wandering the coastal path in England by Raynor Winn. Fascinating, very touching, heartfelt, but also makes me want to sort of hike the salt path, but also not want to hike the salt path because it was an extremely arduous task. And then I read Soul Hot's book on Jeeves and the King of Clubs, which was written in the P.G. Wodehouse style, but it is very much outdoes P.G. Wodehouse, if there is such a way to do that. And then in August, my favorite book was a biography of Sam Phillips called The Sun King by Crouch. Some of you may know Sam Phillips founded Sun Records and got Carl Perkins, Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, and others their start. Roy Orbison. Fascinating. My favorite book in September was Amber Scher's book, Subpar Parks. Subpar Parks. She takes funny tweets and social media posts from people saying, hey, there's no internet in this national park, and highlights a national park based on a disparaging comment that someone made about it and says, hey, this is a remarkable park. And of course, as a geographer, I love that book. And then in October, I've read this before, but I read Man on the Run, which I read a lot of music biographies. This is a biography of Paul McCartney in the 70s by Doyle, Man on the Run. Love that book. And I read it again this year. In November, my favorite book in November was The Age of Islands by geographer Alastair Bonnet. I love things that Alastair Bonnet writes, and The Age of Islands was fascinating. Man-made islands, naturally occurring islands from volcanism and other things. I also read The Earth Abides by George Stewart, which was from a geographer. George Stewart was a geographer at the University of California, Berkeley for 50 years. His book was one of the first sort of post-apocalyptic, in this case, which is kind of appropriate for today, sadly. There was some sort of virus, there was some sort of health issue, and 99% of the population died. I actually didn't like that book. It started off kind of interesting, but then it was just kind of depressing and sad, and not much happened for the last 250 pages. But I have to recognize it for what it achieved back in the late 40s, I believe. That was Earth Abides. Didn't really like that one. So let's get back to some of my favorites. In December, No One Goes Alone, Eric Larson's first, from what I understand, novel. I've read a lot of Eric Larson's historical nonfiction, and this was quite fascinating, especially the first 2/3 of the book. I really loved that. I also read Journeys North, another book about the Pacific Crest Trail. This one was from Barney Mann, but this one really got into how in the world do people go on those long trail hikes? I mean, how do they maintain their cache of supplies and also their cache of funds? And what makes people leave the trail? And it was all about this cohort of about 12 hikers on the Pacific Crest Trail. Fascinating. They leave in the heat of the California desert. They end up in a big snowstorm at the Canadian-Washington border. Fascinating. Journeys North by Barney Mann. And then finally, one of the last books I read for the year, but definitely one of my favorites for December, the long-awaited McCartney lyrics book, A through K. I learned a lot of things about Paul McCartney that I didn't know before, and I've read a lot of books about him, but this is from his own voice finally. But he did it in not an autobiography way, he did it with his lyrics. So I learned things like how much he appreciated his high school teacher, the fact that he played Bill Black's bass on Cook of the House, his stand-up bass, and all kinds of other fascinating things. That was McCartney's first of 2 installments, A through K, so songs that begin with A and end with songs that begin with K. Those are my favorite books from 2021. What did you read in 2021? Thanks.